11:1. The cranberry sauce had congealed into a perfect crimson circle on my good china, untouched like so many things in this house that once mattered. I stared at it through the kitchen window, watching the November light fade behind the oak tree. Elijah and I planted 32 years ago when we bought this place. Back then I thought I was building something permanent. Back then I believed in the mythology of family. Mom, are you coming? We're doing the toast thing. My son Kenneth's voice carried that familiar edge of impatience, the same tone he'd used since he was 12, and I'd asked him to clean his room. Except now he was 38, and the room was my entire life. I smoothed my dress, the navy blue one, with the small pearl buttons, that Elijah always said brought out my eyes, and walked back into the dining room. The table groaned under the weight of tradition. The turkey I'd been up since 5 a.m. preparing the stuffing, made from my mother's recipe. The green bean casserole that nobody really liked but everyone expected. 18 people crowded around the mahogany table that had been my grandmother's, their faces flushed with wine and the comfortable cruelty of family. Kenneth stood at the head of the table, his wife Judith beside him, her manicured hand resting possessively on his shoulder. She wore a cream-colored sweater that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, her blonde hair styled in those perfect waves that only come from expensive salons. Everything about Judith screamed money, the kind of money that made people forget their manners, their gratitude, their basic humanity. Before we eat, Kenneth announced, raising his wine glass, I want to make a toast. His voice carried the same theatrical quality he'd inherited from his father, the same need to be the center of attention to the woman who taught me what not to become. The words hit me like a physical blow around the table. Faces turned toward me with a mixture of embarrassment and cruel amusement. My daughter-in-law Alexis, married to my younger son Henry, actually snorted with laughter. My grandson Paul, barely 20, looked down at his plate, his face red with second-hand shame. But the others, they were enjoying this. They were feeding off my humiliation like vultures. Kenneth, I said quietly, my voice steadied despite the earthquake happening in my chest. What, Mom? It's just a joke, he grinned. That same boyish smile that had gotten him out of trouble his entire life. Come on, you know I'm kidding. You taught me to work hard, to not settle for less. You taught me what mediocrity looks like, and I vowed never to live like that. Mediocrity. The word echoed in my mind as I looked around the table at the feast I'd spent 3 days preparing, at the house I'd maintained with my own hands for 3 decades, at the faces of the people I'd sacrificed everything for. This was mediocrity, according to my eldest son. This woman who'd worked 2 jobs to put him through college, who'd sold her engagement ring to pay for his wedding, who'd babysat his children for free every weekend, while he and Judith went wine tasting in Napa. This woman was mediocre. You know what, Kenneth? I said, standing up slowly. My legs felt shaky, but my voice was getting stronger. You're absolutely right. The room went quiet. Someone had turned off the football game in the background, and I could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway marking time with its relentless tick. I did teach you what not to become, I continued, walking around the table toward him. I taught you not to be generous. I taught you not to be grateful. I taught you not to be kind. I stopped in front of him, close enough to smell the expensive cologne Judith had probably bought him. I taught you all these things by being their opposite, by being foolish enough to believe that love and sacrifice meant something. I reached up and kissed his forehead the way I had when he was small and afraid of the dark. His skin was warm and familiar, and for a moment, I remembered the boy he used to be. The one who would crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, who would bring me dandelions from the yard and call them flowers. That's why I rewrote the will this morning, I whispered against his skin. Happy holiday. The silence that followed was different from the one before. This wasn't the uncomfortable quiet of social awkwardness. This was the silence of a house right before the roof caves in, when everyone knows something catastrophic is about to happen, but no one can quite process it yet. Kenneth's face went white. What did you say? I said I rewrote the will this morning at 9 a.m., to be precise. Harold Stevenson has been my lawyer for 23 years, and he was very understanding about the urgency. I looked around the table at all the faces staring back at me. You see, I had an epiphany yesterday while I was grocery shopping for this lovely meal. I was buying organic turkey because Judith mentioned she only eats organic, and I was calculating how much I'd have to take out of my retirement fund to afford it. When I realized something, I paused, letting the words settle. In the kitchen, the timer was going off. Probably the pies I'd made from scratch, the apple and pumpkin that had been family tradition since before any of these people were born. I realized that I've been living like a servant in my own life, making myself smaller and smaller to accommodate everyone else's comfort, spending my money, my time, my energy on people who see me as an obligation at best, an embarrassment at worst. Henry, my younger son, shifted in his seat. Mom, what are you saying exactly? I'm saying that the house you've been planning to inherit, Kenneth, the one you and Judith have been measuring for that kitchen renovation, it's not going to you anymore. None of it is. The timer kept ringing in the background, insistent and sharp, but nobody moved to turn it off. Nobody moved to tall off. Where's it going? Kenneth's voice was barely a whisper. I smiled then, and it felt like the first genuine smile I'd had in years. That's the beautiful thing about Wild's sweetheart. They're full of surprises. The smell of burning pie crust began to drift from the kitchen, acrid and bitter in the warm air. I walked toward the kitchen, my heels clicking against the hardwood floors. Elijah and I had refinished ourselves when the boys were small. At the doorway I turned back. Dinner's ready, I announced. Please, everyone, enjoy. It's the last Thanksgiving I'll be cooking for this family. As I disappeared into the kitchen, I heard Kenneth's chair scrape against the floor, heard Judith's sharp intake of breath, heard the murmur of voices rising like a tide. But I didn't turn around. I had pies to save. And for the first time in decades, I was saving something just for myself. The kitchen was filled with smoke, but I didn't mind. Sometimes things have to burn before they can be rebuilt. Sometimes destruction is the only path to freedom. I turned off the timer and opened the oven door. The pies were ruined, their crusts black and crumbling. But I found myself laughing as I pulled them out, the sound echoing off the walls of the kitchen, where I'd spent so many years feeding people who had forgotten how to be grateful. Behind me I could hear Kenneth's voice rising, demanding answers I wasn't ready to give. But that was tomorrow's problem. Tonight, I had a decision to make that would change everything. The question was I finally brave enough to make it? The dining room erupted the moment I disappeared into the kitchen. Through the thin walls, I could hear Kenneth's voice cutting through the chaos like a blade through silk. She's bluffing, he said. But there was a tremor underneath his confidence. She's just trying to get attention. You know how she gets. That was Henry, my younger son, his voice higher than usual. Kenneth, when has Mom ever threatened to change her will before? When has she ever done anything like this? I stood at the kitchen sink, running cold water over my wrist. An old trick my mother had taught me for staying calm. The water was shock cold against my skin, grounding me in the present moment. Outside the window, the neighbor's cat picked its way delicately across the frost-covered lawn, independent and sure-footed. I envied that cat. She's upset about the toast. Judith's voice carried clearly through the wall. It was just a joke. She's being completely unreasonable. Was it funny? This was Paul, my grandson, his young voice cutting through the adult conversation. Because nobody was laughing, except you guys. Grandma looked like you'd slapped her. Paul, mind your own business, Kenneth snapped. Adults are talking. I'm 20. I am an adult. There was something in Paul's voice I'd never heard before, a steel that reminded me of my own mother, and I saw Grandma's face. That wasn't a joke. That was me. The kitchen door swung open, and Kenneth appeared, his face flushed with wine and anger. He'd inherited his father's build, tall and broad-shouldered, but where Elijah had carried himself with quiet dignity, Kenneth had the aggressive stance of a man who'd never been truly challenged. Mom, we need to talk. I didn't turn around. Instead, I focused on scraping the burnt remains of the pies into the garbage disposal. The sound was harsh and final, like grinding bones. I'm busy cleaning up your mess. My mess? His voice rose an octave. You're the one who just announced you're cutting your own children out of your will over a harmless joke. Harmless? I turned around slowly, leaning against the counter. Tell me, Kenneth, what's harmless about humiliating your mother in front of What's harmless about calling her mediocre after she spent the last 3 days preparing a feast for your ungrateful family? He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I recognized from his childhood. The same movement he'd made when caught in a lie. Look, maybe I went too far, but but I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Kenneth, you looked me in the eye and called me everything you didn't want to become. You turned my love into a cautionary tale. You made me into a warning. That's not what I meant. Then what did you mean? I took a step toward him and he actually stepped back. Explain to me what you meant when you said I taught you not to settle for mediocrity. Explain how that was supposed to be a compliment. Behind Kenneth, Henry appeared in the doorway, his wife Alexis hovering behind him. Henry had always been the gentler of my two sons, more like his father in temperament, but even his face was hard now, calculating. Mom, Henry said carefully, maybe we should all sit down and talk about this rationally. Rationally. I wiped my hands on my apron, the one with the faded sunflowers that Kenneth had given me for Mother's Day when he was 8. You want to talk rationally about how your brother just publicly humiliated me and now you're all worried about your inheritance. It's not about the money, Alexis said, though her voice lacked conviction. It's about family, about not making rash decisions when you're emotional. I studied her face, the perfectly applied makeup, the designer dress, the jewelry that cost more than most people's monthly salary. Alexis had married Henry 3 years ago, a whirlwind romance that had started 6 months after his first wife died. She'd swept in with her youth and her ambition, and Henry had been grateful for the distraction from his grief. You're right, I said quietly. It's not about the money, it's about respect. It's about recognizing that I'm not just some old woman who exists to serve your convenience. Nobody thinks that, Kenneth said. But his voice was hollow. Don't they? I reached into my purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper. This is a list I made yesterday while I was grocery shopping. Do you want to hear it? Mom, in the past 6 months, I continued, unfolding the paper, I have babysat your children 16 times. 16 times you and Judith have called me at the last minute, because your regular sitter canceled or you had an emergency dinner with clients, or you just wanted a date night. 16 times I've canceled my own plans to accommodate you. Kenneth's face was growing redder. You're our mother. That's what grandmothers do, is it? I looked down at the list. In those same 6 months, you visited me twice. Twice, both times, because you needed something. Once to borrow my car when yours was in the shop. Once to ask me to co-sign a loan for your kitchen renovation. That's not fair, Henry, I continued, not looking up from the paper. You've called me exactly once in the past month to ask if I could pick up Alexis from the airport because your meeting ran late. When I mentioned that I'd been feeling lonely, you told me to get a hobby. The kitchen had gone silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of the football game. Someone had turned back on in the living room. Through the doorway I could see the other family members pretending not to listen while straining to hear every word. And the money, I said, my voice getting stronger. Shall we talk about the money? The down payment I gave you for your house, Kenneth. The $20,000 you borrowed 2 years ago that you've never mentioned paying back. The credit card I co-signed for you, that you maxed out and then defaulted on, leaving me to pay. We never asked you to. Henry started. No, you didn't ask. You just assumed that because I'm your mother, because I love you, because I've always been there, that I would continue to be there forever, that I would continue to make myself smaller and smaller until I disappeared completely. I folded the paper and put it back in my purse. But I'm not disappearing. I'm 62 years old, and I have maybe 20 good years left if I'm lucky. I'm not spending them being your unpaid servant. 62, Kenneth's voice cracked. Mom, you're 62 years old. You can't just throw away your family. I'm not throwing away my family, I said. I'm throwing away the version of myself that allowed my family to take advantage of me. Behind them I heard the front door open and close, followed by the sound of footsteps on the hardwood floor. A moment later Paul appeared in the kitchen doorway, his jacket in his hand. Grandma, he said quietly, I'm leaving. This is who. He looked around at the adults in the room, his young face full of disgust. This is gross, all of it, Paul, Kenneth said sharply. You're not going anywhere, we're having a family discussion. No, Paul said, and his voice was calm and clear. You're having a family intervention, because you're worried about your inheritance. There's a difference. He walked over to me and kissed my cheek. Happy Thanksgiving, Grandma. I'm sorry they're being such a language, Alexis said automatically. Truth, Paul replied. He looked at me again. Can I call you tomorrow? I want to hear about this will thing when they're not around. I smiled at him, the first genuine smile I'd felt all day. I'd like that. After Paul left, the kitchen felt smaller, more suffocating. Kenneth and Henry exchanged glances, some silent communication passing between them. They were planning something, strategizing. I could see it in their faces. Mom, Henry said finally, maybe you should talk to someone, a therapist, or what? I interrupted. A doctor, someone who can declare me mentally incompetent, so you can contest the will. The look that passed between my sons told me everything I needed to know. They had already thought of that. They were already planning my destruction. Get out, I said quietly. Mom, get out of my house. My voice was still now, forged in the fire of 38 years of motherhood and disappointment. All of you now, you can't just, I can do whatever I want. It's my house, my rules, my life. I walked to the kitchen door and held it open. Get out. They left finally with muttered protests and wounded looks. I stood in the doorway and watched them gather their families, their coats, their righteous indignation. The house felt different as they filed out, lighter somehow, as if a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying had been lifted. The last to leave was Kenneth. He stopped at the door, his face a mask of hurt and anger. You'll regret this, he said. Maybe, I replied, but I'll regret it as a free woman. After the door closed behind him, I stood in the empty hallway, listening to the silence. For the first time in years the house was truly mine. The question was, what was I going to do with it? The silence lasted exactly 12 minutes. I knew because I'd been standing there counting the ticks of the grandfather clock, letting the emptiness wash over me like a baptism. Then the phone rang. I let it ring, and it stopped, then started again immediately. Kenneth, no doubt, calling from his car to deliver whatever ultimatum he'd crafted on the drive home. The answering machine kicked in after 6 rings. Elijah's voice, still preserved after 3 years, warm and steady. You've reached the home of Elijah and Nancy Brown. Please leave a message. Mom, it's Kenneth. Pick up the phone. We need to discuss this like adults. You're making a mistake, and I'm trying to help you fix it before you do something you'll regret forever. Click. The phone rang again 30 seconds later. Mrs. Brown, this is Judith. I think there's been a misunderstanding. Kenneth is upset, and I think we should all sit down tomorrow and talk through this calmly. I'm sure we can work something out, as if my dignity were a business negotiation. Click. The third call came 5 minutes later. Henry this time, his voice tight with anxiety. Mom, Kenneth told me what you said about the will. Look, if this is about money, we can talk about that. Maybe we can set up some kind of arrangement. Call me back, okay? Don't do anything rash. An arrangement. My own son wanted to negotiate the terms of my love. I walked to the answering machine and unplugged it. Then I unplugged the phone in the kitchen, the one in my bedroom, the one in Elijah's old study. The silence that followed wasn't empty anymore. It was full of possibility. I poured myself a glass of the good wine, the bottle I'd been saving for a special occasion that never seemed to come. The Bordeaux Elijah had bought for our 30th anniversary. The one I'd told myself I'd drink when the boys graduated, when they got married, when they had children, when they finally appreciated what I'd sacrificed for them. Well, tonight was special enough. Tonight was the night I stopped waiting for permission to live my own life. The turkey sat abandoned on the dining room table, its golden skin now cold and congealed. 18 place settings surrounded it like a jury of my former life, each plate bearing witness to the woman I used to be, the one who measured her worth by how well she could serve others. I began clearing the table methodically, scraping plates into the garbage disposal, stacking china with the practiced efficiency of decades. But instead of washing them, I carried them to the kitchen island and left them there. Tomorrow's problem, tonight belonged to me. The wine was making me brave, or maybe it was just the absence of their voices, their needs, their constant low-level disapproval. I walked upstairs to my bedroom, mine now, not out. Elijah had been gone 3 years, and opened the closet, behind the sensible dresses and cardigans, behind the clothes I wore to blend in and take up less space, hung the red dress I'd bought the week after Elijah's funeral and never worn. I'd tried it on in the store, shocking myself with how it transformed my reflection. The color brought out the silver in my hair, made my skin glow. The cut was elegant but daring, nothing like the shapeless garments I'd been hiding. The saleswoman, a girl young enough to be my granddaughter, had clapped her hands and said, "You look beautiful, you should definitely get it." But when I'd brought it home, Kenneth had been there fixing a leaky faucet. He'd seen the shopping bag, and made some comment about dressing my age, about not wanting to embarrass myself. So, the dress had hung in my closet for 3 years, tags still attached, waiting for courage I wasn't sure I possessed. Tonight I possessed it. I slipped out of the navy dress with its sensible buttons and stepped into the red one. The silk whispered against my skin like a secret. I looked at myself in the full-length mirror Elijah had installed when we'd remodeled the bedroom 10 years ago. The woman looking back at me wasn't the mediocre mother Kenneth had toasted. She was someone else entirely, someone with fire in her eyes and steel in her spine. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, a text from an unknown number. "Grandma, it's Paul. I saved your number from Dad's phone. Are you okay? That was really badass what you did tonight. Call me if you need anything." I smiled, typing back, "I'm more than okay. Thank you for standing up for me." His response came immediately. "They deserved it. Dad and Uncle Kenneth have been talking about you for years when you're not around." I'm sorry I never said anything before. The wine and the revelation hit me simultaneously. They'd been mocking me behind my back, turning my love into a joke they shared when I wasn't there to hear it. The woman who'd given them everything had become their private source of entertainment. My fingers trembled as I typed. "What kind of things? Maybe we should talk in person. Are you free for lunch tomorrow? Somewhere they won't look for you." "Yes, text me the address." I set the phone aside and walked to Elijah's study, the room I'd kept exactly as he'd left it. His books lined the shelves, his reading glasses still sat on the desk next to the crossword puzzle he'd been working on the morning he died. I'd turned it into a shrine, but tonight it felt like a prison. On his desk next to the glasses lay the folder Harold Stevenson had given me that morning. The new will, properly witnessed and notarized, legally binding and irrevocable. I opened it and read through the pages again, savoring each carefully chosen word. "To my sons Kenneth and Henry, who taught me the difference between love and obligation, I leave $1 each in recognition of the exact value they placed on my contributions to their lives. To my grandson Paul, who showed me that respect is not inherited but earned, I leave my car and $50,000 to pursue his education, without the burden of debt his father and uncle accumulated to the shelter for abused women downtown, where I plan to volunteer my remaining years. I leave my house and the majority of my estate so that other women may find the sanctuary and support I was privileged to discover too late. And to myself, for the first time in 62 years, I leave the freedom to choose my own path." The doorbell rang, sharp and insistent in the quiet house. I glanced at the clock, nearly 10 p.m., too late for social calls, too early for emergencies. I walked to the front window and peered through the blinds. Kenneth's BMW sat in my driveway, engine running. He stood on my porch, shifting from foot to foot like a child who needed to use the bathroom. Behind him, 11:02. Judith waited in the passenger seat, her face illuminated by the blue glow of her phone. The bell rang again, followed by sharp knocking. "Mom, I know you're in there. We need talk." I stepped back from the window, my heart racing. The old Nancy would have opened the door, would have apologized for upsetting everyone, would have begged them to come back and pretend none of this had happened. The old Nancy would have torn up the will and gone back to being grateful for whatever scraps of attention they threw her way. But the old Nancy wasn't wearing a red dress. "Mom," Kenneth's voice was getting louder, more desperate. "I'm not leaving until you open this door." I walked to the intercom system Elijah had installed after a break-in scare 5 years ago. I pressed the button and spoke clearly. "Kenneth, you have 10 seconds to get off my property before I call the police. You can't be serious." 10:08. "Mom, I'm your son." 7:6. I heard him say something to Judith. Heard car doors slam. Through the window I watched the BMW reverse out of my driveway, its taillights disappearing into the darkness. My hands were shaking, but not from fear, from power, from the intoxicating realization that I could say no and make it stick. I poured another glass of wine and walked back to the dining room, looking at the abandoned feast with new eyes. All that food, all that work, all that desperate attempt to buy love with roasted turkey and homemade cranberry sauce. What a waste. What a beautiful necessary waste. Tomorrow I would start over. Tomorrow I would have lunch with my grandson and learn what my sons really thought of me. Tomorrow I would call the women's shelter and ask about volunteering. Tomorrow I would begin the process of becoming the woman I should have been all along. But tonight I would dance in my red dress in the house that was finally completely mine. I would finish the bottle of good wine and eat the expensive chocolates I'd been saving for guests who never came. I would celebrate the death of the old Nancy Brown, the woman who had mistaken doormat for love. The grandfather clock chimed 10 times, marking the hour of my resurrection. In the distance I could hear my neighbor Grace playing piano, something classical and beautiful that floated through the winter air like a promise. I raised my glass to the empty room, to the cold turkey and the abandoned dreams, to the life I was finally brave enough to claim. To the woman I'm about to become, I said aloud. The sound of my own voice, strong and certain in the silence, was the most beautiful thing I'd heard in years. I woke the next morning without an alarm clock for the first time in 40. The winter sun filtered through my bedroom curtains, painting geometric patterns on the hardwood floor. No turkey to prepare, no family obligations to fulfill, no one's needs to anticipate but my own. The silence was luxurious. My phone showed 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. I deleted them all without reading them and headed downstairs to make coffee in the French press. Elijah had bought me, the one I'd never used because Kenneth had said it was pretentious, and regular coffee was good enough for normal people. The coffee was exceptional. At 11:30, I drove to the address Paul had texted me. A small cafe in downtown Portland, 20 minutes from my house, but a world away from my usual haunt, the kind of place with mismatched furniture and local art on the walls, where young people worked on laptops and the baristas knew everyone's name. I'd never been anywhere like it. Paul was already there, sitting in a corner booth with his back to the wall like a young conspirator. He looked up when I walked in and his face broke into a genuine smile, the first I'd seen from any family member in months. "Grandma," he said, standing to hug me, "you look different." I was wearing the red dress under my wool coat paired with boots I'd bought years ago, but never worn because Judith had said they were too young for me. "I feel different." We ordered coffee for him, chai tea for me, something I'd never tried but had always been curious about. Paul fidgeted with his napkin, looking older than his 20 years. "So," he said finally, "how much trouble am I in for yesterday?" "With me? None. With your father, I imagine quite a bit." He laughed, but there was no humor in. "He called me at 6 a.m. this morning, told me I was manipulated by an unstable old woman and that I needed to think about my future before I chose sides." "And what did you tell him?" "I told him I wasn't choosing sides. I was choosing right over wrong." Paul looked at me directly, his young face serious. "Grandma, what they've been saying about you, it's not okay." My chai arrived warm and spiced with cardamom and cinnamon. I wrapped my hands around the mug, letting the heat steady me. "Tell me, are you sure you want to know, Paul? I spent 62 years protecting myself from uncomfortable truths. I'm done with that now." He nodded and pulled out his phone, scrolling through what looked like a group text. "This is from last month. Dad, Uncle Kenneth, Aunt Judith, and Aunt Alexis. They have a group chat called Dealing with Nancy." The name hit me like a physical blow. I was a problem to be dealt with, a burden to be managed. "Read it to me." Paul's voice was quiet, ashamed. Uncle Kenneth wrote, "Mom called again about feeling lonely. Judith thinks we should just let her get a cat and stop expecting us to be her entertainment." Then Dad responded, "She needs to accept that we have our own lives. The constant guilt trips are getting old." And Aunt Judith wrote, "At least when she dies we won't have to pretend to care about her feelings anymore." I set down my mug carefully, my hands remarkably steady. "When she dies there's more." Paul's voice was barely audible. "Uncle Kenneth said, thank God left everything to her in the will. When it comes to us we can finally sell that house and split the money. Maybe then we can afford to put the kids in private school." They'd been planning my death, not hoping for it exactly but certainly planning for it, anticipating it, calculating the profits from my corpse. The house Elijah and I had built our life in, where I'd raised their father, where I'd created every good memory they possessed. It was just real estate to them. "Paul," I said slowly, I need you to understand something. What I'm about to do, it's going to get worse before it gets better. Your father and uncle are going to be very angry with you for telling me this. I don't care. His voice was firm. Adult. They're wrong. You're not a bird. You're not mediocre. You raised two successful men. You took care of Grandpa until he died. You've been the backbone of this family for decades, and they treat you like you're some embarrassing relative they have to tolerate. I reached across the table and took his hand. Thank you for seeing me, for seeing the truth. So what's your plan? I smiled, and I could feel the edge in it. Patience. Strategic patience. Over the next 2 hours Paul told me everything. The loans I'd co-signed that they'd never intended to repay. The times they'd laughed about my pathetic attempts to stay relevant in their lives. The way they'd mocked my loneliness, my cooking, my clothes, my entire existence, whenever I wasn't around to hear it. With each revelation, I felt something inside me crystallize into diamond-hard resolve. This wasn't just about the will anymore. This was about justice. When we left the cafe, Paul hugged me goodbye and promised to call every week. Not because I asked, but because he wanted to. I drove home with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. The house felt different when I walked in. Not empty but spacious, full of potential. I went upstairs to Elijah's study and called the number I'd looked up that morning. Safe Harbor Women's Shelter. This is Eddie speaking. Hello, my name is Nancy Brown. I'd like to volunteer. That's wonderful. Can you come in this week for an interview? We always need people who actually. I interrupted. I'd like to discuss a larger donation as well. I'm planning to leave my house and estate to your organization, and I'd like to understand how you'd use the resources. The silence on the other end lasted several heartbeats. Miss Brown, perhaps you should speak to our director. Can you hold for a moment? 5 minutes later, I had an appointment for Monday morning. My next call was to Harold Stevenson, my lawyer. Nancy, I've been expecting your call. I imagine yesterday was eventful. Harold, I need you to draw up one more document, a letter of intent regarding my estate to be delivered to my sons immediately. What kind of letter? The kind that lets them know exactly where they stand. I want them to understand that their inheritance isn't delayed, it's gone permanently, and I want them to know why. Nancy, are you certain about this? Once I send that letter, there's no taking it back. I thought about the group chat labeled Dealing with Nancy. I thought about Kenneth's toast, about Judith's casual cruelty, about 38 years of taking their contempt and calling it love. Send it today, Harold. All of it, every detail of the new will, every reason for the changes, every dollar they're not getting. I want them to understand the full scope of their loss, and if they contest it, then they'll lose twice. I'm of sound mind. The will is ironclad, and I have witnesses to their behavior. Let them try. After I hung up, I walked through my house with fresh eyes. Every room held memories of the woman I used to be, the one who'd cooked and cleaned, and sacrificed and served, always hoping that enough love would eventually be returned. That woman was gone now, and I felt no grief for her passing. In the kitchen, I finally tackled the dishes from Thanksgiving dinner, but instead of my usual careful efficiency, I moved slowly, thoughtfully. Each plate represented a choice I was making. To keep this one because I liked its pattern, to donate that one because it only reminded me of obligation. I was curating my life for the first time, keeping only what brought me joy. My phone rang at 3. Kenneth, of course, I answered on the 4th ring. Hello, Mom. His voice was tight, controlled. I just got a very interesting letter from your lawyer. I imagine you did. We need to talk, all of us. Tonight. No, we don't. Mom, you can't be serious about this, leaving everything to strangers, cutting out your own sons over a stupid joke. It wasn't a joke, Kenneth, and they're not strangers. They're women who understand what it feels like to be undervalued and discarded. They'll appreciate what you never could. This is insane. You're throwing away our family over. I'm not throwing away our family. I'm simply acknowledging that it never existed in the first place. You and Henry made that clear yesterday. The silence stretched between us, crackling with 38 years of resentment and disappointment. You'll regret this, he said, finally. The only thing I regret is waiting so long to do it. I hung up before he could respond. The afternoon light was fading when I heard a car in my driveway. Through the window I watched Henry get out of his sedan, his shoulders slumped with defeat. He walked to my door slowly, like a man approaching a funeral. This time I opened it. Hello, Henry. He looked older than he had yesterday, worn down by whatever conversation he'd had with Kenneth. Mom, can I come in please? I stepped aside and let him enter. He stood in my hallway like a stranger, looking around as if seeing it for the first time. Nice dress, he said quietly. Thank you, Mom. I know what Kenneth did was wrong. The toast, the things he said. But this is too much. You're destroying our family. I studied his face, looking for any sign of the boy I'd raised, the one who'd brought me dandelions and called them flowers. All I saw was a middle-aged man calculating his losses. Henry, when is the last time you told me you loved me? He blinked, caught off guard. What? When is the last time you called me just to see how I was doing? When did you last visit without needing something? That's not fair, isn't it? I walked to the living room and sat down, gesturing for him to join me. Tell me about your life, Henry. Tell me about your marriage, your work, your dreams. Tell me anything that isn't about what you need from me. He sat on the edge of the couch, his hands clasped between his knees. For a long moment, he said nothing. I can't, he whispered finally. Because you don't see me as a person, I said gently. You see me as a function, a source of free labor and emergency money and last-minute babysitting, but not as a woman with her own hopes and needs and feelings. Tears were running down his face now. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Mom. I know you are, but sorry doesn't change the pattern. Sorry doesn't give me back the years I spent waiting for you to love me the way I loved you. Please, there has to be a way to fix this. I looked at my younger son crying in my living room and felt nothing but pity. There is, Henry, but it doesn't involve the will. The will is just paper. The real fix would require you to see me as human, and I don't think you're capable of that anymore. He left 20 minutes later, defeated and empty-handed. I watched his car disappear into the twilight, and felt the last threads of maternal obligation dissolve. Tomorrow I would begin my new life in earnest. Tonight I would savor the sweetness of justice. Finally, perfectly served. The phone rang again, but I didn't answer. I had better things to do than deal with Nancy. 3 months later, I stood in the main hall of Safe Harbor Women's Shelter, watching Abigail Waters arrange fresh flowers on the reception desk. The daffodils were just beginning to bloom. Early spring in Oregon, full of promise and new beginnings. Abigail was one of the residents, a woman my age who'd fled an abusive marriage after 35 years, arriving with nothing but the clothes on her back and a lifetime of fear. These are beautiful, I told her, adjusting one of the yellow blooms. They brighten the whole room. My grandmother always said daffodils were hope flowers. Abigail replied, her voice still soft from years of speaking carefully. They push through the frozen ground when everything else is still sleeping. Hope flowers. I liked that the shelter had welcomed my donation with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. A 4-bedroom house in Portland's Laurelhurst neighborhood, plus enough money to run their operations for 5 years without worrying about funding. Eddie Chase, the director, had cried when I'd signed the papers. You understand, this changes everything for us, she'd said. We can expand our programs, provide longer-term housing, offer job training. You're giving these women their lives back. What I hadn't told her was that I was giving myself my life back too. My new apartment was small but mine, a 1-bedroom place 6 blocks from the shelter, walking distance from the cafe where Paul and I met every Tuesday for lunch. I'd kept only what brought me joy: Elijah's books, my grandmother's china, the red dress that had started my revolution, and a few photographs of the boys when they were small and still capable of love. Everything else had been donated or sold, including the engagement ring Kenneth had always assumed would go to Judith. Nancy. Eddie appeared in the hallway, her clipboard in hand. The new intake is here. Would you mind helping her get settled? This was my favorite part of volunteering, the moment when a woman crossed our threshold and realized she was safe. I'd been there for dozens of these moments over the past 3 months, each one a small miracle of courage and survival. The woman waiting in the intake room was younger than me, maybe 45, with dark hair and the hollow-eyed look of someone who'd been running on fear for too long. Her name was Joan Bell, and she clutched a small suitcase like a lifeline. Welcome to Safe Harbor, I said, sitting across from her. I'm Nancy. I help new residents get oriented. Is it true, she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, that I can stay here as long as I need? That he can't find me? It's true, you're safe here. We have security systems, legal advocacy, counseling services, and more importantly, you have a community of women who understand exactly what you've been through. Joan started crying, then not the desperate sobs of grief, but the quiet tears of relief. I handed her tissues and sat with her in the silence, remembering my own moment of awakening, 3 months ago in a kitchen filled with smoke and burned pies. How long does it take? She asked finally. What? To stop feeling like you're nothing, to remember who you were before you disappeared into someone else's definition of you. I smiled. For me it took about 62 years, but I think you might be faster. After I'd helped Joan settle into her room, I walked the 6 blocks home through the crisp March air. Portland was waking up from winter, trees budding with green promises, the city humming with possibility. My phone buzzed with a text from Paul. Dinner Sunday. I want you to meet someone. Someone. My grandson was dating apparently and wanted his grandmother to meet her. The thought filled me with a warm satisfaction that had nothing to do with matchmaking and everything to do with being chosen, being included, being valued. I texted back, I'd love to. Should I cook? God, no, let's go somewhere nice. You've done enough cooking for one lifetime. As I climbed the stairs to my apartment, I could hear music drifting from 2B. My neighbor Grace, a retired music teacher who played piano every evening, she'd become an unexpected friend. This woman who lived alone by choice and thrived in her solitude. We had coffee together most mornings, sharing stories in silence in equal measure. Nancy, Grace called from her doorway as I passed. Perfect timing, I just made too much soup again. This was Grace's way of taking care of people, pretending she'd accidentally made too much food when really, she was making sure her friends were fed. I appreciated the dignity of it, the way she offered care without making the recipient feel like a charity case. I'd love some, let me grab one. We ate in her living room, surrounded by plants and books and the comfortable clutter of a life well lived. Grace was 73, had never married, and radiated a contentment I'd never seen in any of my married friends. She was what I was learning to become, complete unto herself. How are the boys this week? She asked, knowing that Kenneth and Henry had been calling daily since the will reading. Persistent, Kenneth showed up at the shelter yesterday, demanding to speak to Eddie about my mental state. She had security escort him out. Grace laughed. I like this Eddie woman more every day. Henry's been leaving flowers on my car, expensive arrangements with guilt-inducing cards about forgiveness and family. And how does that make you feel? Nothing. The honesty of it surprised me. I feel nothing. It's like watching strangers perform someone else's tragedy. Good. Grace raised her wine glass to feeling nothing about people who never earned the right to your feelings. We drank to that. Later, as I prepared for bed in my small perfect apartment, I thought about the woman I'd been just 3 months ago, that Nancy had measured her worth by how much others needed her, had confused servitude with love, had believed that making herself smaller would somehow make her more valuable. This Nancy knew better. My phone rang as I was brushing my teeth. Kenneth, for the 3rd time this week. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to the message, while I moisturized my face with the expensive cream I'd bought myself, the kind I'd always thought was too indulgent, too selfish. Mom, it's me. Listen, I know you're angry, but this has gone on long enough. Judith's pregnant. You're going to be a grandmother again, and this baby deserves to know you. Call me back please. A baby. Another grandchild to love and lose. Another little person who would grow up learning to see me as disposable. The old Nancy would have called back immediately, would have rushed over with gifts and offers to help, would have been grateful for another chance to prove her worth. This Nancy deleted the message, because I'd learned something crucial in my months at the shelter, working with women who'd survived the worst kinds of love. Real love doesn't require you to disappear. Real love doesn't diminish you or demand your silence or punish you for taking up space. Real love sees you as fully human, worthy of respect and consideration, and basic kindness. My sons had never learned to love me. They'd learned to use me to exploit me to extract what they needed while giving as little as possible in return. And I'd enabled it, mistaking their taking for loving, their convenience for affection. No more. The next morning, I was arranging donations in the shelter's clothing room, when my phone rang. Paul's number. Hi, sweetheart. Grandma. His voice was strange.